Welcome to another episode of Marketing Tips for Doctors. I'm your host, Dr. Barbara Hales. Today, we are going to visit why medical podcasts matter more than ever. You know, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, why did you even start a podcast? And honestly, the answer has very little to do with marketing. This podcast was born out of frustration, concern, and ultimately hope. Because over the years, I noticed something happening in healthcare that became impossible to ignore. Patients had more access to information than ever before, but somehow they were becoming more confused. Doctors were exhausted. Patients felt rushed. Trust was slipping, and meaningful communication in medicine was quietly disappearing. People were turning to the internet for answers about their health, and instead of clarity, they were finding fear, misinformation, extreme opinions, miracle cures, and influencers pretending to be medical experts. At the same time, many physicians had tremendous knowledge and experience, but no real platform to explain things calmly, clearly, and humanly. And I realized something very important. Education has become part of healthcare itself. That's where this podcast came from. Not from ego, not from wanting attention, but from wanting to help people think more clearly about their health. Because here's the truth. Most healthcare decisions are no longer made only in the exam room. They're being influenced on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook groups, Google searches, and yes, podcasts, which means the quality of medical communication matters enormously now. And that's why these conversations are important. People often ask why podcasts connect so deeply with audiences. And I think the answer is simple. People are starving for authenticity. They don't want to be talked down to. They don't want complicated medical jargon designed to impress other doctors. And they don't want constant fear-based headlines screaming, everything you're doing is killing you. People want honesty. They want clarity. They want someone who can explain complicated things in a calm, intelligent, understandable way. And podcasts do something unique. They allow people to hear your tone, your compassion, your thoughtful process, your humanity, and that builds trust. Sometimes patients feel like they already know a doctor after listening to several episodes. That connection matters because medicine works best when trust exists. How podcasts help both doctors and patients? You may be wondering this. Well, for patients, education reduces fear. When people understand their conditions, their medications, their risk factors, their options, and the reasoning behind medical decisions, they feel empowered instead of helpless. Educated patients ask better questions. They participate more actively in their care. And in many cases, outcomes improve. but podcasts also help doctors. And I think this is something people don't talk about enough. Many physicians went into medicine because they genuinely wanted to help people. But modern medicine can become incredibly transactional. 15-minute appointments, endless documentation, insurance battles, burnout. Teaching reconnects doctors to purpose. It reminds physicians that communication itself can be healing. And honestly, sometimes one thoughtful conversation can help more people than an entire week of rushed office visits. When podcasts disagree, then what? Well, here's where things get interesting. Patients will often hear two podcasts with completely opposite opinions. One says, never eat carbohydrates. Another says, plant-based nutrition is the answer. One says, take this supplement. Another says, that supplement is useless. So, how is the average person supposed to know who's right? First, don't panic. Different opinions in medicine do not automatically mean someone is evil or incompetent. Medicine is not mathematics. It involves science, clinical judgment, individual differences, risk versus benefit decisions, and evolving research. Reasonable experts can disagree, but patients need a framework for evaluating what they hear. So, what should patients do? First, never make major health decisions based on one podcast episode. A podcast should educate you. It should not replace personalized medical care. Second, be cautious of people who sound absolutely certain about everything. Real medicine usually contains nuance. If someone says, this works for everyone, doctors are hiding the truth, or this cures everything, that should raise concern. Good medicine acknowledges limitations, exceptions, uncertainty, and individuality. Third, look at motivation. Is the person educating you or selling fear? Because fear has become a business model online, and frightened people click very quickly. Now, let me tell you a story that beautifully shows how podcasts can actually help patients when handled thoughtfully. A woman in her late 50s had been listening to several health podcasts because she was trying to improve her overall wellness. One episode discussed early warning signs of heart disease in women, not dramatic movie-style symptoms, subtle ones, fatigue, shortness of breath, jaw discomfort, exercise intolerance, and she realized she had quietly been experiencing several of those symptoms for months. Now, here's the important part. She didn't panic. She didn't diagnose herself online. She didn't start taking random supplements. Instead, she used the information intelligently. She scheduled an appointment with her physician and said, I heard a discussion that made me wonder if I should get evaluated. Her doctor took it seriously. Testing eventually revealed significant coronary artery disease. She needed intervention. And afterward, she said something incredibly powerful. The podcast didn't save my life because it gave me treatment. It saved my life because it gave me awareness. That's exactly what responsible medical education should do. Not replace doctors, not create fear, but encourage thoughtful action. But now let me tell you the other side. A younger woman became convinced by several online personalities that all prescription medications were toxic. One podcast after another reinforced the same message: natural healing only. Doctors overprescribe. You don't need medication. So, without consulting her physician, she abruptly stopped her blood pressure medication. She felt proud at first, empowered, like she had taken control. But several weeks later, her blood pressure skyrocketed. She developed severe headaches, dizziness, and eventually ended up in the emergency room with dangerously elevated blood pressure. Thankfully, she recovered. There are others doing that wind up stroking out. But afterward, she admitted something important. I confused confidence with credibility. And that sentence stuck with me because sounding confident online does not automatically mean someone is correct. What is the real purpose of medical podcasts? The best medical podcasts do not demand blind trust. They encourage critical thinking. A good podcast should help patients ask better questions, recognize misinformation, feel calmer, and become partners in their healthcare. The goal should never be believe me blindly. The goal should be become informed enough to make wiser decisions. That's a very different mission. So, if today's conversation helped you see healthcare a little more clearly, share this episode with someone who may need it too, because informed patients and connected doctors create better medicine for everyone. And honestly, that's exactly why this podcast exists. I'll see you next time. This has been another episode of Marketing Tips for Doctors with your host, Dr. Barbara Hales. Till next time.